Well, good morning, everyone. General Sullivan, generals in the audience, senior non-commissioned officers, Sergeant Major Preston, Command Sergeants Majors, leaders from industry, friends from the press, colleagues, and supporters of the Army. Thank you all for coming out here this morning to listen to what I might have to say about our budget situation as we look at where we are in Fy15 going into Fy16. This morning what I'd like to do is talk to you about kind of three things. I'm going to start by talking about where we are today, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse into our budget request for Fy16, and then talk a little bit about sequestration. One of the things, let me go to the first chart, please. So I've only got two charts this morning. And I'm not going to go into the real nitty-gritty details of our budget. You can find our budget rollout information and the details of our budget on our website. It's been out there since we rolled it out on the 2nd of February, and I suspect most of you in this room have probably taken a look at that already, because I know you're interested in where we are. But I want to kind of start with this chart right here and talk to you about where we've been. Now, this chart starts in 2012. And what it doesn't show you is the years that were preceding this chart, which would show you the buildup as we ramped up from 2003 to 2008, 2009, where we became steady in our funding from 2008 to about 2012, and then we start in with this chart. So in that ramp up, what we were able to do was we were able to build the forces that the nation needed in order to fight the wars. We grew our strength very rapidly. We modernized our brigade combat teams. We reorganized our brigade combat teams. We fielded new equipment in weapons and communications and soldier protective systems so that we could support the demands of war. Our funding in those years tripled in about 6 years in order for us to meet the demands of war. So we were very busy as an Army, and all of our leaders were very busy in our Army trying to really manage that growth in our funding, but more importantly, trying to manage how we build readiness to meet the demands of war. And we were able to meet those demands. And then we found ourselves kind of leveling off in our funding from about 2008 to 2011. And then what happened in 2011, as you all know, is that was when we finished the drawdown out of Iraq. So what came about at the same time during that period of time was really two things: a new defense strategy that came into play in 2012 and a Budget Control Act. With the new defense strategy, the Army began the business of trying to figure out how we would draw down from war and how we would reorient our readiness building away from focused counterinsurgency operations that had been demanded of the Army in times of war to more full-spectrum decisive action capabilities. The plans that were put in place would take us over several years in order to achieve the readiness that we would need to achieve. And the funding that would be required is what we would build into our program for 2012. But at the same time that happened, something else happened called the Budget Control Act, which was passed in August of 2011. That Budget Control Act really, as everyone in here knows, brought our budget levels down in order to save money for the government. Our 2012 submission, in fact, for the Department of Defense was a budget submission and a program that was brought down quite significantly by nearly $500 billion before we even submitted it. And you can see what the numbers are there for what we submitted and then what we actually executed. So to orient you to the chart, the top black line is the amount of funds that we have requested in our budget request year by year. The blue line is what we actually executed. So in 2012, we sort of worked through what would happen if the team of leaders in our government, in our Congress, could not develop a plan to achieve the rest of the savings to get to the $1.2 trillion in savings that was needed. And in fact, they could not develop a plan, and so that put into place this automatic sequestration that faced us in FY13. So when we came to FY13, we did in fact face sequestration. Not to relive the year, but it was a very complicated year. We had a continuing resolution that lasted for about 6 months. when sequestration then kicked in, and so we had to find the savings that we had to achieve, which were very significant in the last 6 months of the year, and we had an OCO problem that year. So for the Army, bottom line for Readiness is that this meant that we ended up canceling 7 CTC rotations, canceling some other training so that we could save the money that was needed, and we ended the year with just 2 non-deployable brigade combat teams ready, in a ready posture. So now we find ourselves here in Fy14 and Fy15. Those 2 years, these 2 years are characterized by the Bipartisan Budget Act that was passed. The Bipartisan Budget Act allowed us to request a budget that was a little bit higher than the sequester line being 117 and 117 at the bottom of the chart, but we were able to request a little bit higher than that in 14 and in 15. So they sort of met us halfway. We were not able to get what it is that we thought we needed. Again, trying to get back to restarting our readiness building towards this full spectrum capability, but they met us about halfway. So what's interesting about FY14 is our budget request was not 126, it was really 122 billion. And this all, by the way, is a base discussion, not counting any OCO. But what you see there is a number of 126. So why is that? Well, that's what we actually executed in FY14. The Congress gave us about $3 billion in OCO funding that we were allowed to use on base purposes. And then we had some reprogramming actions. So why that's significant is because even in the year that we were sequestered and in the year of the Bipartisan Budget Act with lower funding levels, we spent about $126, $127 billion to rebuild the readiness that we needed for the nation. And we're still not where we need to be. We ended FY14 with about 30% of our brigade combat teams ready. And in FY15, we are hoping, to sustain that. I shouldn't use the word hoping because that's not the good word. We are planning to sustain that as we move forward. But the challenge that we see here is the funding level that we're at. In FY15, we're at $121 billion in our request. And that includes the $850 million of OCO that the Congress is allowing us to use on base purposes. So we see a decrease in funding here going from 14 to 15. And right now across the Army, that's what our commanders are wrestling with. We have focused our priorities on building readiness, and I'll talk about that as I give you a glimpse into PB16. And so our readiness building and our readiness training is happening across the force. But we've taken risk in other areas that are very important in installation readiness primarily that we are going to have to figure out how we can solve as we get to the rest of the year. And then that brings me to FY16. Our FY16 budget request is $126.5 billion. It's an increase from our FY15 levels, and that increase is something that's very necessary for us to be able to create this sustainable readiness that we need in the nation. One of the things that when you look at this is, the downside of our budgets that corresponds with the downsizing of the force that was supposed to correspond with less demand for Army forces. But in fact, what we've all found, and as you all know, is we've had just the opposite happen. We have increasing demands for our Army forces. Just in the last year, we had what we call the 3 big things that have come up that were totally unplanned a little over a year ago. And that is the response to the aggression in the Ukraine, that is the response in Iraq to ISIS and ISIL, and the Ebola crisis in Africa. And we were able to respond to what we needed to do in those areas because we had forces who were ready to go. The concern that we have as we look forward to the future is if we continue to have uncertain funding levels, it will impact our ability to be able to meet that full spectrum readiness that we think we need across the force in order to provide for these kinds of missions. Now, as I look at FY16, some of the things that are happening across our Title 10 responsibilities, our Army is continuing to shrink. We'll be at 490 in the active force, 490,000 in the active force, 335,000 in the Army Guard, and 202,000 in the Army Reserve at the end of this year. We will continue to shrink in FY16 by another 15,000 soldiers in the active component, another 8,000 in the National Guard, and another 4,000 in the Army Reserve. We are continuously reorganizing our brigade combat teams as we shrink the number of brigade combat teams that we have in our forces. We are modernizing, but our modernization strategy is an incremental strategy that builds on the equipment that we have, not buying new equipment at this time, because we just can't afford to do it right now. Our equipment sustainment continues to be reliant both on OCO and on the base. Reset funding is very important to the Army as we bring equipment out of the theater and reset it and return it to units around the Army. The industrial base that performs a lot of our sustainment activities, the depots, the arsenals, the ammunition plants, are very important to how we sustain this capability as we look forward to the future. The real challenge that we have there is the workload is declining. As our Army gets smaller, the workload to those activities gets smaller. And so we have to figure out how do we put a strategy in place to make sure that we sustain that capability, because that's an element of readiness that we need to hold on to for the future. So inside of our 16 budget, if you were to take a look at it, you would see that 60% of our budget is really paying for people. We are a people-centric organization, and that counts military people and civilians. So that leaves only about 40% for near-term readiness and long-term readiness. So on the near-term readiness side, that's the activities that we need to build training and readiness operations day to day. The long-term readiness is our readiness capability for the future, and that's where much of our procurement and RDT&E is focused. How do we see forward and look out to the new capabilities that we're going to have in the future to meet the demands that we are just now starting to get a glimpse into and see. So in the near-term readiness, though, I break that down in my mind into 3 different areas: equipment, facilities and installations, and then training. In our equipment sustaining, I talked about relying on OCO. We continue to do that. That's a real challenge for us. From a budget perspective, the challenge is how do we bring that full workload back into the Army? It's a significant amount of funding that we get in OCO for this function, and eventually that has to come back into the base budget, and that's a concern when you see these kinds of pressures on the budget. The second area of readiness is installation readiness. This is where we deliberately take risk in our program, in our base operations support accounts, and our sustainment accounts for our facilities. And we recognize that as we continue to defer a lot of our repair and maintenance modernization efforts on our facilities, it's going to cost more in the future, and it's going to mean that our quality of life is going to come down at our installations. And so that's what we wrestle with when we get into the year of execution, with how can we solve that? What are the most critical items that we have to execute, that we have to perform in support of our installations and the people who live at our installations? And then training. Training is where we are really focusing today and in FY16. And what we're doing in our training is that we are leveraging the ideas that are coming out of the Army's operating concept that really suggest that our future is very uncertain and very complex and very unknown. So the way we get after meeting the demands of that is we start to look at how we can build leaders who can think through these complexities in the future and who can be prepared to meet these unknown demands of the future. And we build that leadership in a few different ways. One way that we do it is in our institutional schools through educational opportunities, and we're building increased ability to do that, increasing our funding for that for both military and for civilians. We are standing firm on our commitment to combat training center exercises because we firmly believe that this is a way that you build depth of leadership experience. You get the captains, you get the majors, you get the lieutenant colonels who go through these rotations time and again, and they build that kind of experience that they haven't been able to build so far because of the focus on the counterinsurgency missions. And then lastly, we are focusing on strengthening our partnerships with our allies and other armies all around the world. The President has said that he believes part of our strategy is to build this network of partnerships, and that's what the Army is doing. We are conducting exercises around the world in various different programs to build that network. Our modernization strategy is really focused on the soldier, what the soldier wears, the weight of what the soldier wears, what the soldier shoots, and the communications technology. The network is continuing to be a big priority for the Army. You've had several leaders from across the Army come and speak to you about the network, about the cyber threat, and we are working to get after that. The DoD CIO has just recently adopted the Army's plans for the Joint Regional Security Stacks as the platform for security across the enterprise for DoD. So that's good news for the Army. It's something we've been working on for a long time, and that's going to continue to come to fruition as we work on increasing our capabilities for the network. In procurement, we're focusing on our aviation platforms. There are those aircraft that fit inside of the aviation restructure initiative. And then on our ground vehicle strategy, we are just incrementally improving what we already have. And we're working on change proposals that will increase the power or the protection and provide the abilities to increase network capabilities, but still on the platforms that we already have. We've not lost sight of a future infantry fighting vehicle. We're investing some S&T funding into continuing to refine the concepts and the designs that we think we need there. And then we have just awarded the contract for the armored multipurpose vehicle to begin building the prototypes for that as the replacement for the armored personnel carrier. That's starting this year. We have several initiatives in science and technology focused really on the threat, the cyber domain, and on our aviation capabilities, just to name a few. Our MILCON funding is at the lowest levels that it has been, certainly for this century, but for many years. We're at $1 billion in our request. That's very low level funding, so we don't see much activity there because of affordability. Now a little bit about OCO. OCO is about 15% of our budget. You don't see it here on the chart. If you did see it here on the chart, you would see that it is declining very, very rapidly. Our OCO over the last 4 years has shrunk by about 60%. And that has funded a lot of our operations that are focused on the theater and focused on getting soldiers ready for the theater. So when a soldier trains and goes to a deployed mission in Iraq or Afghanistan or Kuwait, OCO funds pay for that training. As we draw down in these operations, we have to figure out how to bring those training funds back into the base. That's another pressure on our base as we look forward. There's something else that's happening in OCO, and that is some new authorities that are coming about. Several years ago when I first came back into the headquarters budget business, our OCO was pretty much in two SAGs, two big areas. And we had like just one big pot of money, and we could decide how we needed to spend it. And then over time, they started to bring, the Congress asked us to bring our spending into our normal accounting categories, our activity groups. And so it became a little bit more defined in how we built our OCO budget. And so what's happening today is something that's a little different in the fact that we're coming out with some new authorities. The European Reassurance Initiative, the Army requested and received about $440 million this year, about $500 million next year. This is the money that's going to pay for the activities that we need to increase our presence in Europe. The Iraq Train and Equip Fund, that's about a $1.6 billion fund that OSD, Comptroller, controls. We can go and ask for money that we need from that fund, and we have done that already. We've asked for $400 million to support what the Army needs to support those missions. And then in FY16, the department has requested the Syria Training and Equip Fund. So these new authorities, the thing about them is that they are what allows us to find a resource to fund these emergent activities without having to spend our base funds. So I think they're very important to us, and the support to have the funding in these funds and make that funding predictable is very important to how we can operate in the future. So that's kind of a quick run through on our budget. The big question that we've been getting as we've delivered our budget to several different venues over the last few weeks is, what about sequestration? What happens? Well, if you look at the chart there, the difference between what we requested, about $127 billion in our base, and what we think our sequester level will be, we think it might be about 121, is about $6 billion. About 60% of that is in near-term readiness, and about 40% of that is in far-term readiness. Now, we've been through this once before, and we've learned some lessons from FY13. And one of the lessons that we learned is that we have to protect our training planning and our continuum of training that builds readiness. And so one of the things that we've already decided is that if we have to reduce our spending, we're going to protect our combat training center exercises. So that means that what will happen is that funding has to come out of something else. in those near-term funding areas. So home station training is going to probably get less money. If you're in a brigade that's going to the CTC, you'll be funded to get yourself prepared to do that. If you're not, then you will not have enough money to build high-level collective readiness. And if we will start to see perhaps deferment in equipment sustainment, and we will start to see deferment in our facility sustainment projects, which is where we have already taken risk, and so that will become very problematic. Our depots and our arsenals, our ammunition plants will continue to see a downturn in their work, which impacts their ability to work efficiently into the future. And these are the people who bring the material solutions and the personal solutions, the people solutions, to helping us fix equipment on the battlefield and get it back into the hands of soldiers. It's a capability that we have to plan for and we have to protect. Our modernization programs will be impacted by budget cuts in that what we are trying to do and the timelines that we have today will just keep slipping further to the right. So this risk that is coming at us here sort of year by year is very interruptive to the continuum of planning that it takes to build readiness. Now, the nation depends on the Army to be ready when it's called upon for unusual missions that we cannot predict on a day-to-day basis. And as I've just mentioned, we've seen this happen in Europe, we've seen it happen in Africa and in Iraq just recently. Let me get the next slide. So I just want to leave you with this picture as some feedback to what we're doing and how we're doing. This is a picture from a magazine in Lithuania. It might be a little risky for me to show this because somebody in here might actually be able to read this, and I can't. But, but I'm told that, and I picked this picture up, by the way, on my travels to Europe about 3 or 4 weeks ago. They shared this with us, and I thought it was very powerful. It's a Time magazine in Lithuania, and this is their Man of the Year issue for this magazine. And for their Man of the Year, they named the NATO soldier. And that NATO soldier that they chose to be on the cover of their magazine is an Army soldier. I think that's very powerful. That's feedback for us on what's happening with the partnerships that we're building out across the world with this network of partnerships that our Commander-in-Chief has asked us to build. But in order for us to uphold the broad readiness and to make sure that that soldier is prepared to go to that very unusual mission, we have to have predictability and continuity in the funding so that we can continue to build the readiness that the nation needs, not only for these kinds of missions, but also for the full spectrum, the decisive action missions that if the nation calls upon us to perform those missions, we have to be ready to do that. So with that, I will stop and ask if there are any questions.
Everyone happy with the money?
Sydney.
Ma'am, Sydney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. I said I would hold the obnoxious questions until after you actually spoke, and here I go. You and General Odier and many others have mentioned, Ebola, Islamic State, Russia and Ukraine, and sort of this trifecta of new challenges we didn't expect, and certainly we didn't expect them. But in terms of magnitude, in terms of the number of forces involved, in terms of the amount of money involved, these aren't surges like in Iraq or Afghanistan. So why are these three things so stressing the Army? Is it like the 90s where we were sending, modest amounts of troops to the Balkans, but just we weren't set up, so we were breaking divisions to send brigades? What's going on that makes these three things so hard for an Army that has sent, dozens of BCTs into combat for a year, 15 months at a time in recent memory?
Okay, well, Sydney, thanks for that question. It's taken in and of itself, if that's all that the Army was doing, if those were the only 3 missions that the Army had, it would not be that hard. But you have to look at these emergent dynamic missions in the context of everything that's going on in the Army today. And what's going on in the Army today is we are still in Afghanistan, and we are still deployed in 140 locations around the world. I mean, today we have more than 140,000 soldiers that are forward stationed or forward deployed around the world. We have 9 of our 10 division headquarters who are engaged in missions around the world. And so, we are very, very busy. And at the same time, the other part of the context is understanding what are we doing to downsize. When you looked at that chart that I had that showed the funding going down, that takes a huge amount of leader effort to make sure that as we rebuild the brigades, as we reorganize the brigades, and we move people around, we're moving the right people to the right places so that we can build readiness. Readiness is all about the people in the unit, it's about the equipment in the unit, and it's about their ability to train. So all of that is the backdrop for these 3 missions coming up. And so when these missions come up, it's not something that was in our plan, and so we are then responsive to the demands to meet those commitments. That's what makes it so challenging. It's really within the broader context of everything else that's going on.
Good morning, Megan Eckstein with Defense Daily. On your budget chart, you showed a $2.6 billion difference in procurement between your requested levels and what you might get under sequestration. I wondered how you imagine that might play out if we go to sequester level. Would it be all programs that would sort of evenly distribute those cuts, or do you hope to protect some over other programs?
Well, you've asked me a question that I really can't answer because it will really depend on what the rules of the sequestration are. If we look at FY13 as a guide, the guidance was we had to reduce every single program line by an equal percentage. That was the guidance. We had no choice in that. And I don't know what the guidance will be for 16. Certainly, I think as we think ahead, it would make most efficient sense for us to be able to look at our programs and decide what would we need to defer maybe to achieve that savings so that we can continue to focus on some of our priorities. But that's really going to be out of our control in terms of what the guidelines will be.
Alan Mitchell, Inside the Army. I have a similar question to Megan. You said that with sequestration, the Army would go down by $6 billion, and you said modernization programs would be impacted. Are there any programs in particular that you would, I guess, defer more so than others?
Okay, well, first of all, let me make sure that it's clear. I said that we expect our sequester levels to be about $121 billion, and that would be about a $6 billion deficit. That's not a foregone conclusion. The sequester level is really at the Department of Defense level, and then within the Department of Defense, each of the services will receive, an allocation of that. This is our expectation today based on what we know about the situation ahead. And so within that split between our focus on readiness of 60% and 40% towards procurement, I don't really know, I can't tell you today what specific programs might be impacted. Certainly, all of our programs might be impacted in some extent in terms of shifting them to the right, in terms of our inability to achieve some of our goals on time. So, sorry, I can't give you any kind of further insight than that.